Hi, my name's Jasmine, and you are listening to The Wick Files. When innocence cracks, the truth bleeds through. And today we are covering the Susan Smith case.
Some stories make you uncomfortable, not because of what happened, but because of what people failed to see. A quiet town, a young mother, two small children. On the surface, it looked like a tragedy that could happen to anyone. But underneath, there were warning signs. Untreated pain, a slow unraveling that went unnoticed until it was too late. This case is not just about what went wrong, it's about what was missed. Susan Smith was born in 1971 in Union, South Carolina, a small town where everyone knew everyone, but a lot of pain still stayed hidden. From the outside, her life looked ordinary, but when you look at the pattern of her childhood, you start to see instability everywhere. Her mother had a rocky emotional life of her own. She had multiple marriages, volatile relationships, and a home that never really felt steady. We know when a child grows up in that kind of environment, they don't learn what healthy attachment looks like. They learn that love can leave, that people disappear, and that security isn't something that they can count on. And that's what we see with Susan. When Susan was just 6 years old, her father died by suicide. That kind of loss hits differently, especially when you're that young. It doesn't just make you sad, it changes how safe the world feels. And after that, people close to Susan said she became quieter. She became more anxious, more afraid of being abandoned, and we saw that fear followed her into every relationship she had. A few years after her father died, her mother remarried, and Susan gained a stepfather. As she grew older, Susan would later describe home as another place where boundaries were not protected. And that matters. When a child already has a grieving parent and they experience more emotional and physical harm, it all compounds. It teaches them that love and anger can exist in the same space. By adolescence, Susan was already being treated for serious mental health concerns. She struggled with depression, suicidal thoughts, and disassociation. That feeling of being, outside of your body, watching yourself from a distance. Medical records later re-reference psychotic symptoms and adjustment disorder. That means she had difficulty regulating her emotions and coping with stress. And when I hear this, I really do think about her trauma that was never stabilized. Her nervous system never learned how to feel safe. As a young adult, Susan desperately wanted to feel chosen. So in 1991, she became involved with a married man. To her, that relationship just wasn't an affair, it was validation. It was proof that someone wanted her enough to break their own life. When it ended, she didn't just lose a man, she lost the version of herself that she had built around that fantasy. Then, in 1992, she married a man named David Smith. In previous interviews, we see David talking about how he met Susan at a local grocery store. He says that they worked together and kind of just fell in love. On the surface, it looked like a fresh start, but their relationship was emotionally chaotic. It was stapled by a lot of arguing. They separated often and then reunited repeatedly. We all know how that goes. And they struggled with trust. Susan's fear of emotional abandonment and emotional instability clashed with David's attempt to keep things together. Neither of them really felt secure, but they had two sons, Michael and Alexander. And while Susan did love them, she loved her kids, motherhood just didn't feel like her. It added pressure, it added responsibility, and for someone who already struggled to regulate their emotions and feel stable, it made her feel trapped. By the mid-1990s, the marriage was unraveling yet again. Susan and David were separated, but still legally married, still tied to each other, even as things were falling apart. And during that time, Susan began talking to another man. His name was Tom Finley. Tom Finley represented a life she wanted. He was successful, wealthy, and emotionally distant in a way that made him feel powerful to her. But he was also very clear about one thing. He did not want any children. And we know that Susan has two children. Susan was trying to build a future with Finley while still being married to David and still being a full-time mother to both Michael and Alexander. She wasn't single, she wasn't free, she was caught between two lives that existed at the same time. And when Finley made it clear to her that he did not want children in the future, like she had hoped and imagined, it reopened every old wound that Susan carried. From the abandonment to the rejection to the fear of being unwanted, that was the moment when everything started to fall apart. On October 25th, 1994, Susan Smith was driving around Union County, South Carolina with her two sons, Michael, who was 3, and Alexander, who was just 14 months old. Later, investigators would notice that her movements that day did not look normal. It was not a normal routine. She wasn't just heading somewhere specific. She wasn't running errands. She was circling back roads, quiet stretches of highway, and rural areas near John D. Long Lake. It was the kind of driving that looks like someone is stalling, thinking, or trying to make a decision. That night, Susan ran into a nearby home and told a story that would shock the entire country. She said she had been stopped at a red light when a man approached her car, forced her out, and drove away with her 2 children still inside of the car. She claimed that she ran to the nearest house for help while her sons were taken. She described the person as being a black man wearing a knit cap. But when police began checking her story, things didn't line up. The house she ran to wasn't right at the intersection she had claimed to be at when the man forced her out of her car. It was farther away than she made it sound. The road she described was quiet, dark, and not a place someone would normally be waiting to take a car. There were no skid marks, no signs of struggle, no witnesses who saw anyone matching her description. However, her story was still believed. A national search began. This search was bigger than they had ever seen. Media flooded Union, South Carolina. News anchors reported the suspect description over and over. And when Susan described the man as black, it didn't just launch a search, it shifted the entire atmosphere of the case. Union was a small town with deep racial divisions. Description landed on the top of old fears and stereotypes. Black men were suddenly being pulled over and questioned and watched. I saw lots of interviews and they described it as being a very uncomfortable time for them. People were afraid to walk or drive around without being seen as a suspect. And all of it was based on a vague description coming from a woman whose story was already falling apart. Now, as a school psychologist, this part of the case always stands out to me. When trauma meets bias, innocent people end up carrying the weight. One person's lie can ripple outward and put the entire community at risk. And that's exactly what Susan's story did. While Black people were afraid to leave their house, Susan became a constant presence on national television. She cried on cameras, she begged for her sons to be returned, but behind the scenes, police were watching her very closely. There's some raw footage from one of her interviews that later became public, and we see that before the cameras officially rolled, Susan was smiling, chatting. She even appeared to be excited to be on television. The moment the interview officially began, tone shifted. Her voice cracked, her body language changed, and then her performance started. Susan was given multiple polygraph tests and she failed all of them. In some interviews, we see David Smith talking about how he even tried to help her pass the polygraph test and she still failed them. The story of a stranger taking her children began to collapse. And then 9 days later, Susan admitted it was all a lie. There was no man at a red light, no stranger, no carjacking. She told the police that what happened to her sons came from her. And in that moment, when innocence cracks, the truth bleeds through. Before we go any further, it's important to stop and remember who Michael and Alexander were. Michael was 3 years old, described as being a curious, talkative, and had a developing personality of his own. Alexander was just 14 months old and still learning how to walk, still discovering the world. They were not just names in this case. They were 2 little boys who were loved, who mattered, and deserved to grow up. Susan had told one story to the world. She had just admitted to the police that it wasn't true. And what really happened that day was far more quiet, far more intentional, and far harder to face. And the truth was sitting in one place nobody wanted to look. That place where no one wanted to look was exactly where Susan sent them. After admitting her story was false, she told the police where to find her car. She directed them to John D. Long Lake. There was no frantic search, no guessing, just a quiet drive out to the water where everything had been left behind. When investigators recovered the vehicle, they found Michael and Alexander still inside. Along with them were deeply personal items. Some of these items included Susan's wedding album and other things tied to her marriage with David Smith. And these details matter. People don't just bring symbols of their marriage with them unless they are thinking about endings, about what they're keeping and about what they're leaving behind. After the car was recovered, investigators needed to understand one more thing: time. They conducted controlled tests using similar vehicles to determine how long it would take for a car to sink once it entered the water. The results showed that it did not disappear right away. The car stayed afloat for several minutes before becoming fully submerged. And that also mattered, because it meant that this wasn't an instant or uncontrollable moment. There was a period of time where Susan could have chosen to help. What was happening could have still been seen, still been felt, and still existed. The boys had been in the water for days by the time their car was found, but the sinking itself was slow enough for investigators to show that this was not an accident. It was a sequence of decisions. And that brings us back to the why. So rewinding, we know that Susan was dating a man named Tom Finley. We also know she was still married to Mr. Smith. It gets a little bit more complicated. Susan was also having an affair with Tom's father. But Tom Finley himself represented everything she felt was missing from her life: the money, the stability, and a way out of the chaos she felt trapped in. But we know he was clear about one thing, and that one thing was something she could not change. He did not want any children. About 1 week before the incident occurred on October 25th, Tom sent Susan a letter. In it, he laid out that boundary in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. This is what he said: "I care about you, but I need to be honest about what I want out of life. I'm not in a position to be in a relationship that includes children. I need something simple, something that doesn't come with responsibilities I didn't choose." And Mr. Finley, like I said, had found out that she was having another affair. Based off of that information, the letter was sent to Susan. And for Susan, that wasn't just rejection. It was confirmation of her deepest fear that she would never be chosen as she was. Susan was living multiple emotional lives at once, all while her mental health was collapsing. In the days leading up to everything, Susan was having suicidal thoughts, emotional breakdowns, and a growing sense that she had no way out. Susan felt trapped between who she was and who she wanted to be. She couldn't keep her children and keep the future she imagined. She couldn't walk away from them without losing everything, and she couldn't stay inside the pain she was carrying. So she made a choice that came from desperation, a choice that was quiet, deliberate, and devastating, a choice that shocked the entire nation. When Susan admitted to the truth, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The same country that prayed for her suddenly felt betrayed. The story shifted overnight from a missing children's case to one of the most painful crimes the public had ever witnessed. News outlets that had aired her tearful pleas now replayed them in a very different light. People began asking how they had even been fooled. And many people also began to ask harder questions. Questions about why they believed her. Basically because she fit an image of who a grieving mother was supposed to be and what it was supposed to look like. David Smith later said in interviews that he truly believes Susan's original story. And even in his most recent interviews I've seen from about a year ago, he still makes the same claims. He always believed Susan. He had no idea she was lying to the police until she finally admitted the truth. Like much of the public, he had trusted her, and that trust collapsed all at once. From that moment on, everything changed. Susan was formally charged with 2 counts of murder in the connection of the deaths of her sons. Prosecutors argued that her actions were intentional, not accidental, that her decision to drive into the lake with Michael and Alexander in the car was more than just a moment of despair. It was a sequence of choices that have devastating consequences. On the other hand, her defense team centered much of their case on her mental history. We know that she suffered with depression, dissociation, and emotional instability. They sought to explain her behavior through that lens. They suggested that she was overwhelmed and not fully in control of her actions. During the trial, defense attorney Judy Clark made one of the most memorable statements. She said that this case is not about evil, but this case is about despair and sadness. Those words were a part of the effort to humanize Susan's turmoil, but they were not enough to sway the jury. During the trial, reporters came from all across the nation. The seats were filled. Every detail was broadcasted, analyzed, and debated over. What had begun as a regional tragedy had become a national conversation about motherhood, disbelief, and accountability. After deliberating, the jury found Susan guilty on all counts of murder. Instead of pursuing the death penalty, the court sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. For many people, that sentence did not feel like closure. I mean, when you think about it, it's just 15 years per child. Many people question whether someone who had taken their own children's lives should ever have the chance to walk free again. Because her sentence included the possibility of parole, Susan became eligible for release in November 2024, exactly 30 years after her conviction. So that was only like a year or so ago. When her first parole hearing took place, it drew national attention. The story was being retold all over again. With multiple news outlets covering it live, the reactions were mixed, but largely opposed to any release. At the hearing, Susan spoke directly to the parole board. She said, "I know what I did was horrible. I know what I did was horrible, and I would give anything if I could go back and change it." She did express remorse and said she wanted forgiveness, saying that time had changed her and that she was a different person than the one who committed the crime. But the board was persuaded by the severity of the offense, the lasting impact on the community, and statements from law enforcement. There was also statements from family members who also opposed her release. The parole board unanimously denied her application. David Smith, her ex-husband and the boy's father, was among those who spoke against her release. He said that he did not believe Susan had truly changed and that her actions were unforgivable. The next opportunity for parole is set for November 2026, so that is this year. And as long as she remains incarcerated, she will have the chance every 2 years to petition again. The reaction of the 2024 denial reflected something deep. For many, certain acts leave wounds that last a lifetime, wounds that time cannot heal, and sentences do not fully address. And that's the truth we're left sitting with. Because when something like this happens, people want numbers, years, sentences, parole dates. We want something that feels like it balances out the scale of the wrong that was done. But some losses just don't balance. 2 children don't just come back because time passed. Michael and Alexander are not statistics. They are not cases. They are 2 little boys who were supposed to grow up, laugh and get older and become people. That future was taken from them. I want to talk about some of my thoughts and opinions surrounding this case, and I'd love to hear yours. But first, let me be clear. Understanding Susan Smith's mental state does not mean we are excusing what she did. She had options, she had people around her, she had access to help, and none of those options included harming children. But if we close this case file by ending it and stating that she was just an evil woman, we miss out on what this case is actually telling us. Because when innocence cracks, it rarely happens all at once. It tends to happen slowly through loss that isn't treated, through trauma that isn't protected, through warning signs that go unnoticed, and through systems that don't step in when they should. Susan didn't appear out of nowhere. She was shaped by grief, instability, and a lifetime of feeling unwanted. From the time she was a child, the people who were supposed to protect her were either gone, inconsistent, or unsafe. She learned early that love could disappear, that attachment wasn't secure, and that being chosen was something you had to chase. When someone grows up like that, their sense of worth often becomes tied to whether someone decides to stay or leave. Rejection doesn't just equal hurt, it feels like proof that they don't matter. And that emotional wiring doesn't just disappear with age. Instead, it shows up in relationships, in desperation, and in the choices people make when they feel like they're about to lose everything. Now, like I said, that doesn't excuse what she did, but it does help explain why. When she felt rejected again, her world didn't just feel painful, it felt unlivable. This case also forces us to confront how easily the public can be misled, how quickly biases can turn into a nationwide search, and how desperately we want to believe certain stories when the person telling them looks the way we expect the victim to look. Susan was believed and a community was put at risk, and 2 children were already gone. So when people argue about parole, forgiveness, and whether enough time has passed, what they're really wrestling with is this. Some actions leave cracks so deep that no amount of time can fully close them. What matters the most when innocence cracks is who notices, who steps in, and who chooses to protect the people who cannot protect themselves. And I think we can all agree that Michael and Alexander deserved that. That is the case of Susan Smith. Thank you so much for watching the Wick Files, and we will see you next week with a new case.